Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. He's one of 50 priests in the U.S. trained for a very special ministry. And the demand for his services is growing at an alarming rate. By his own account, he receives 20 calls a week from people desperate for help. Father Vincent Lampert is a Vatican-trained exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. He's traveled all over the world talking about his experiences doing battle with evil. I sat down with him here in Washington, D.C. recently to discuss his ministry and why he believes demonic activity is on the rise. Take a look. Father, we seem to be seeing an explosion in demand for, pardon the crude term, your services as an exorcist. Why do you think we're seeing this increase in both attention as well as perhaps authentic possession now rather than years before?
People oftentimes ask me, is there a greater sense of evil in the world today? My response always is, I think that I don't know that the devil has upped his game, but I think more people today are willing to play the devil's game. You know, faith in God will lead us in one direction, the lack of faith will lead us in another, and certainly faith is on decline in the lives of many people.
What are some of the portals or doorways? I mean, demonic possession, more often than not, doesn't just come upon ambushes as we're walking home in the evening. There are ways that the devil enters in, yes?
Yes, there are. And
what would those be?
And as an exorcist, that would be the main thing I would look for. What's the entry point? Such as ties to the occult. Maybe somebody has been cursed. Somebody's been dedicated to a demon. One hasn't invited a demon in. Broken relationships, a life of habitual sin. These are primarily the ways I think that people can invite evil in.
Wow. And do you think there's something special, and I guess you get this a lot, that sets you apart? Why were you chosen, do you think, to be the exorcist in your diocese?
I jokingly always say I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. So I was appointed 11 years ago, and my bishop at the time said that he was looking for a priest who believed in the reality of evil, but not one who was going to be gullible to believe that everyone who came to him was actually up against the forces of evil.
And how do you train? How does one train for something like this? I mean, you went to Rome, you worked, I know you took that course, there's the course on exorcism, but you actually got involved with this before that course was available.
Yeah, when my bishop appointed me, he knew I was going on sabbatical in the early part of 2006 in Rome. And so he told me while I was there that I should also study this. And I was able to connect with a priest over there who allowed me to train under him. So during the 3 months I lived in Rome, I was able to participate in 40 exorcisms that he performed.
Wow. And you still took the job.
A life of obedience as a priest.
I'll say. Were you at all frightened by being party to this? I mean, you're seeing this phenomena. Oftentimes, the guttural voices, there are things at times that can levitate their cold spots. I mean, I've spoken to many of your confreres who speak of this sort of phenomena. Did you experience any of that, and did it cause you to hesitate at all?
Yeah, hesitation would be a better word than fear, because I mean, I saw a lot of the traditional things that people describe, eyes rolling back into one's head, foaming at the mouth, growling, snarling, even saw someone levitate during an exorcism. But I came to learn early on that these are all tricks of the devil trying to disrupt the prayer of the church.
You've said that an exorcist is trained to be a skeptic.
Yes.
A lot of people might hear that and go, "Oh, wait a minute, what's he talking about?" Why is it important to be a skeptic?
Because the church wants to make sure that all other possible avenues of what's going on in the person have been addressed. Because it would do greater harm if the church labeled somebody as possessed, if that label would prevent the person from getting the true help that they need.
And how do you evaluate people? They come to the door, they call you, and they say, "Father, I'm possessed," or "My daughter's possessed," or "We think there's a possession here." What happens? What would you do as a first order?
By the time somebody contacts me, there's a protocol that's followed, at least here in the United States, having somebody get a psychiatric evaluation, having one get a physical examination, and then I would do a complete history of the person, trying to figure out if evil truly is present, what was the entry point, and then trying to resume the person's spiritual life. Because it isn't just about praying for someone and casting out evil, it's about helping the person to really establish an authentic relationship with Christ.
Tell me about the levels of possession. There are gradations of demonic influence. It's not all full-on possession where people are, climbing up the sides of the walls. You encounter, you've come across things that are of a lesser variety, but no less distressing and concerning to those involved.
Yeah, there's different types of extraordinary demonic activity. Demonic infestation, the presence of evil in a location or associated with an object. Demonic vexation would be physical attacks that one is experiencing, and then demonic obsession, which would be mental attacks. And then the other one, as you mentioned, demonic possession itself.
Now, in infestation, what does that mean? Describe that. Have you come across that in your work?
I get lots of calls about people who think strange things are happening in their house, or maybe an object that's been cursed. So it would really, if something's been cursed, it's been dedicated to a demon. If something is blessed, it's commended to God. So the role of the exorcist in that case would be to go in and to offer a prayer of blessing and breaking that connection with evil.
So sometimes it's as simple as doing a blessing, a deliverance prayer. What's the difference? Tell people about that, because I think some, even priests, they hear exorcism and they all kind of start pushing away from the table and looking for the exits. Let's face it, it frightens some people. It's seen as something kind of otherworldly that I don't want to get too close to. I told you the story earlier. My daughter, when I said, who are you interviewing tomorrow, Dad? I said, well, I have an author, and I'm going to interview a Father Vincent, who's an exorcist. And she looked at me and said, well, I would recommend you don't shake his hand. I said, oh, great. So, from the mouths of babes, but I think she was wrong. Give me a sense of when you hear that a house is possessed, or or a house is infested. How do you determine that it's infested or not?
Well, you determine if something has actually taken place in that house of an evil nature. St. Thomas Aquinas would say that evil is neither here nor there. We say it's there if it's choosing to act there. So if evil is present in a house, was somebody ties to the occult, was some heinous crime committed there? So trying to determine what brought about that presence of evil.
And a priest can go in and say a blessing, offer a prayer of deliverance without being a designated exorcist in a diocese.
Absolutely, because of those different types of extraordinary demonic activity, any priest can deal with infestation, vexation, and obsession. Really only cases of demonic possession should the exorcist be called upon. And really the notion is that if a priest takes his priesthood seriously, so will the devil.
When you are called in on a case, do you have a team around you? I know some exorcists I've interviewed in the past, they have a medical team, a couple of doctors they consult with. They also have a group of what I would consider sort of prayer backup, prayer warriors who attend the exorcism. How do you proceed?
I kind of look at it differently. In speaking with my bishop over the years, I've always thought the presbyterate of the diocese really is the prayer team. It really is engaging all the priests of the diocese to think about their own vocation, their own calling to priesthood and what that means. And certainly a common theme about being a priest is dealing with the forces of evil and helping people to establish a right relationship with God.
Should you try to recruit fellow priests to come to the exorcism when you're performing the rite, when you're...
Yes, I have absolutely done that, and asked them to be there to pray.
And tell me about that rite. Tell me about that exorcism rite. Some people may be unfamiliar with it. Do you perform it in Latin? And why is it so special and reserved for a designated exorcist?
The ritual of exorcism that came out in 1999 was the last liturgical rite to be updated after the Second Vatican Council. It was tweaked again in 2004, and it basically replaced the one that had been in existence since 1614. But one of the big differences in the new rite, it included supplicating prayers, which are prayers directed to God, which anyone can pray. So the rite really is a liturgical prayer of the Church, really asking God to intervene in the life of one who is being afflicted by evil, and asking God to give that person the sense of peace once again.
Do you prefer the Latin? Some exorcists I've spoken to say the devil hates Latin, so that's all I use.
I don't get caught up in that because I know Latin is the language of the church, but what even more important to me is the holiness of the person.
The intention of the one performing the rite.
Because ultimately the exorcist is trying to take one who's within the realm of darkness and bring them into the light of Christ. I'm reminded of Moses in the Old Testament. When he went to Pharaoh and said, God says to let my people go, what happens to the staff in Moses' hand? It turns into a serpent. But Pharaoh's magicians are able to do the same thing. But what's the difference between Moses and them? Moses is a man of God. So to me, in an exorcism, what I really believe is important is for the exorcist to be a man of God.
You've said that pagan practices can invite evil in and can lead to these various levels of demonic involvement. What does that mean, pagan practices?
It ties to the occult. You know, the word occult comes from the Latin word occultus, meaning hidden or secret. And a lot of those practices are condemned in the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament because they're a violation of the first commandment. Because when people turn to these practices, they're turning away from God and actually putting something else in the place of God.
When you first sit down with someone, you do what? Because not everybody that comes to you is possessed. I mean, they may be showing signs of things. How do you discern?
I sit down and want to talk to them, and I ask them why they believe they're up against the forces of evil. So again, I try to look for that entry point. You know, the church says that there are criteria if one is possessed, such as speaking languages otherwise unknown to the individual, strength beyond the normal capacity of the individual, elevated perception, knowledge about things that they shouldn't otherwise know, and then an aversion to things of a sacred nature. So an exorcist may have a few tricks up his sleeve, if you want to use that word. Maybe I have water, maybe it's holy water, maybe it's tap water. I know that, the person doesn't, but the presence of evil will know whether or not this item, if you will, has been blessed.
So those become tests that you can administer to see if you get a reaction or not.
If you bless them with tap water and they start reacting violently, then maybe it's really something of a psychological nature.
Now, a lot of people who've only seen exorcisms, and which would probably be the majority of us, on television or on a film or on stage, these can happen anywhere, usually in the room of the afflicted or in a house or something. That's usually not where these exorcisms take place. Where do you usually conduct an exorcism?
Well, the devil doesn't get to decide where he will be defeated. So an exorcism always takes place in a sacred space. I always tell people that an exorcism is never going to take place in an abandoned house on a dead-end street at midnight during an electrical storm. The devil doesn't get to decide.
Don't tell Bill Blatty now. He'll get very upset. I'm sorry, Bill. Go ahead.
But the devil doesn't get to decide where he will be defeated.
And what about, you said you invite other clergymen in. How many?
It depends. Obviously, I will determine the location. I will be there, the person afflicted, a family member or two, and then maybe a couple other priests to be present just to be in prayer.
And part of the rite is to get the demon to reveal his identity, to speak the name that is infesting and possessing this person. Why is that a focal point? What does that achieve?
Because knowing the name, when somebody gives your name, you have a certain power or control over them. So when a demon names itself, it's demonstrating that it's finally submitting to the power and the authority of Christ.
And it takes it can take repeated exorcisms for this to happen.
Because it depends on the strength of the evil that's present. My experience is that demons of a weaker nature, when prayers are prayed, they leave immediately. If ones are of a more dominant nature, they're more persistent. I will say, too, there's a difference between exorcisms performed in the pagan world and in the apostate world. So parts of the world where the good news of Christ has never been proclaimed and one's afflicted, the exorcisms are immediate and effective. But in the apostate world, where people have heard the good news, but now they've turned a deaf ear to it, it does seem that evil makes a greater claim on these people.
And is it one entity possessing them, or can it be multiple entities?
It's usually not a question of one, but of multiple. And not that there's a sense of fraternity or collaboration amongst the demons, but it does seem that they act in clusters.
Now, I came across an interview with you, and you said not only is it a demon possessing a person, but souls of the dead can affix or attach to someone. Explain that.
That's really something that's being debated now. Do the souls of the damned kind of wander the earth awaiting the final judgment? So I don't know that there's a definitive answer to that, but it's certainly a question that has been brought up within the International Association of Exorcists, just as a way to debate those types of things.
Have you had any experience with that sort of manifestation?
I have not. I've never encountered that at all.
And how do these possessed people manifest? And do you see a difference, pardon the term, from demon to demon? Is there a difference, or is it primarily the same sort of presenting phenomena?
I think it's pretty much the same. It's usually something of kind of an animalistic nature. If you think about the story of creation, on the sixth day of creation, God created animals and he created humans. But what separates us from animals? That we can choose to honor and glorify God. So since the demons have rejected God, a lot of their manifestations are animalistic.
Tell me for a moment about, we've been seeing a lot of cult-like activity. I talked to friends of mine in law enforcement, and they've been finding dead animals all over the place, beheaded animals. Do you see this as a rise in the occult, in whether it's animal sacrifice or some kind of santeria, or this Santa Muerte, this movement in Mexico? What are we seeing here in the United States?
I think what we're seeing is that because faith is in decline in the lives of so many people, even millennials, I think I read recently that 70% of millennials no longer profess any religious affiliation whatsoever. So as belief in God is deteriorating, there seems to be a growing fascination with these occult practices.
And you think it's filling that void?
It is, because I think the human person has that innate desire for something more. Of course, I would agree with Augustine that, you know, our hearts are restless, O Lord, until they rest in you. But when people have rejected God, they're trying to fill that in with something else.
Tell me for a moment, Father Gabriel Amorth, at the time Rome's chief exorcist, now deceased, he said ISIS is Satan. He was talking about the Islamic State and the way they're manifesting throughout the Middle East, and that this is a manifestation of satanic activity. Would you agree with that?
Well, one would have to say, what is Satan all about? He's about division and hatred and violence. So to that degree, the answer would be yes, because as Christians, we believe that Christ came to create community. He gave us the church. But you look at groups like that, and they're all about violence again, and hatred, and tearing things apart.
And death, and chaos. And chaos, which is another mark of the devil. What is the most misunderstood facet of what you do, and the thing you think people should understand about this ministry, which is what it is?
Exorcism basically is a prayer of the church. It's praying with somebody who is afflicted. I think oftentimes people want to get caught up in all the theatrics of exorcism. You know, I tell people that if you think that you're up against the forces of evil, all you need to do is pray. As a Catholic, go to Mass, receive the sacraments, and the devil's already on the run. But people kind of look at that and they're like, huh? They really are looking for me to tell them to do something extraordinary. But it's very much the ordinary components of our Christian faith that keep the devil at bay.
And often the lack of them that present an opening.
Exactly.
Now, do you, final question, when you see children afflicted, and I don't know how many you may have come across in your work or not, I don't know how high an incidence or low it might be. We don't have any data on that sort of thing. How do you explain that to people when you have a child who, you know, it's not like they were looking to get into trouble or consciously involved in evil practices? I imagine some could be cursed by someone else?
Exactly, because any child under the age of reason cannot invite evil on themselves, either directly or indirectly,
Right.
because God would protect and safeguard them. So for a child to really be afflicted with evil, someone else would have to be the cause of that. Perhaps they've been cursed, dedicated to a demon. You know, one of the exorcisms in Rome that I was able to participate in, the young lady told me that her mother had dedicated her to Satan at her birth. And by the time she was 12, she was able to escape from that environment. She ended up on the streets of Rome, and then eventually made her way to the priest who was mentoring me.
Wow.
And then he was able to get her out of that and break the forces of evil in her life. The great news is that she went on to become a religious sister. And she dedicated her life to working with street children in the city of Rome. She knew what it was like to be on the streets, and so she was striving to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And what's important about that story is that it reminds us that no matter, how one may be involved in evil, no one's ever completely lost to God. God can reach anybody.
Father Lampert, sounds like a good place to end this. Thank you for being here and for your work.